Welcome, everybody. So if you were here already, you got to hear me mention the K-Scope conference. I'll talk about that more at the end. But we are here today to talk about revolutionizing budgeting and planning. Oh, thank you for dropping the link, Brianna, into the chat. That's cool. My name is Edward Roske. I am going to walk you through the entirety history of budgeting from pirating days all the way up to 2022 and all the massive revolutions that have occurred coming out of COVID and the COVID shove that everybody was forced into doing. So to be clear, budgeting is not a new concept. We tend to think of it as like something that just occurred in the last like 30 or 40 years, maybe around the time that a spreadsheet got invented. The word is actually hundreds of years old. Budget, the word budget, it's actually derived from a Latin word, bulga, B-U-L-G-A, meaning a little bag. There was a Gaul word called bolg, meaning bag, and that's actually how it entered English. It originally meant the container. Basically, what you put in the side of the little bag was your budget. It originally meant the bag, and then eventually it came to be known as the stuff inside of it. So the sponsor of a whaling ship would give the bulg, the budget, which is basically a bag of gold coins, and he would give it to the captain of the ship, and he would say, "Here's your budget." And what he meant by that is, let's say there was, I don't know, 1,000, kroners worth of gold coins inside. That's the most that captain had to spend. And whatever that captain had left at the end, that was essentially the captain's profit. So if he, did a really optimal trip and, paid the people less, and I don't know, didn't give as much rum, and he had 100 kroner left at the end, he got to keep the 100 kroner. On the other hand, if there was more than that being spent, then it came right out of the whaling captain's pocket. It actually, because of the way it was used, it actually took on a financial meaning in 1733. This is fun. We joined. Edward's giving us a history lesson. The financial meaning was basically, this is how much money you had to spend. So the whaling captain had a budget of this much money. Any more than that, it came out of his own pocket. By 1760, it actually became the widely used term, but it was only used as a noun. This is your budget. So when did we start using it as a verb, meaning to budget? So I'm actually going to do budgeting. When did that come about? You might think, oh, that's the last 50 years. No, it was actually the 1880s. And what it meant was to plan for how much one was going to expend. I have this much money. How do I plan on spending it? I need to budget my spending. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, how is it actually being used nowadays? So in most companies in the financial world, budget's an annual process. It means a medium to a low level of detail. And it's generally done once a year. That's an annual flower. Why did Edward pick that cool picture? Number one, support for Ukraine. Two, it's an annual thing. And it got bigger and bigger over time. And as companies started to change more rapidly, they realized they needed to modify that budget, especially if something big happened, like, I don't know, a pandemic. So there came about the term adjusted budget. An adjusted budget, generally it's a mid-year process that you only do if something unforeseen happens, something big that's going to impact your numbers. So just like, in the middle of your concert, if you don't really want to stop and retune your guitar, but you might have to, especially if something weird happened, I don't know, the humidity changed, we now have an adjusted budget. Forecast generally means a regular interval process where you are giving a better idea of where your spending is going to go or your revenue is going to come in. Forecast generally is done at a higher level of detail. Most companies historically when they started adding forecasting, did it quarterly. Then companies went to monthly. Then they went to weekly. There are some companies that will do a daily forecast, especially if they're in things like high turnover retail or hospitality. Forecasts, though, traditionally stopped at the end of a time period, like stopped at the end of a year. So we had rolling forecasts, which is an ongoing process where you look out generally at least 2 quarters. The default everyone kind of picked without ever consulting each other was 18 months, but it's based on whatever your confidence window is. And a rolling forecast generally is replaced with actuals through the current month, and then you go out a period. And it's generally If forecast is higher level, rolling forecast is even higher level than that decreases in level of detail as it goes forward. What do we call, like say we're mid-year, right now we're at the end of March, what do we call 3 months of actual and 9 months of forecast? The term that the industry tend to use is working forecast. Quite often the working forecast also means whatever the most open forecast is, the current one that's active. So how do we talk about all that? Like what if we want to talk about anything forward-looking, forecast, working forecast, budget, adjusted budget, blah, blah, blah. The simple answer, plan. It's just a generic term, means budget and forecast. Now, I'll tell you that nobody ever looks forward to budget season. Nobody's ever like, oh, good, I get to spend the next 3 months of my life coming up with a high-level number, submitting it, then the CFO is going to tell me I'm wrong. Why? Where's all that pain actually coming from? Well, first of all, the traditional way of budgeting, it's a time suck. It takes you away from doing what you feel is value added anyway. Whenever you're done with the numbers, someone else changes them. And they generally never even look back to say who submitted it. So there's no ownership of the individual numbers. Whatever the corporate process is, people export it to Excel and do it their own way. So even though they think there's this common process, there's all the ad hoc craziness. How do people do that ad hoc? They do it in the duct tape of business, Microsoft Excel, where there's no data integrity whatsoever. And on top of all this, people keep asking for more and more information, larger and larger and larger volumes of data. And there's more. We tend to submit the results of our budget. We are going to make $17 million in revenue. We're going to spend $12 million in expenses. There are a whole lot of assumptions that go into that we don't ever communicate. So all people ever know is your final number was wrong, and they don't know what led into it. Well, what led into it was it's not just a $17 million revenue number. We're going to make this much per customer. We're going to make this much per location. We're going to make this much per service offering. We're going to make this much each individual month. Every time we go this by this by this, we're adding dimensionality to, and we're probably doing it in a form, which has 2 dimensions, right? Stuff in the rows, stuff in the columns. How do we deal with that? Whenever people submit their numbers and then they end up being wrong, there are 2 people that get yelled at, generally the CFO for consolidating it all. And then it's as if nobody in the middle ever saw it. And it goes all the way down to the bottom person. They get yelled at for their department being wrong. And we forget that whole path in the middle where everybody actually went and approved it, because there's just this lack of kind of trackability of workflows. And how do we solve it? With ever more increasingly complex spreadsheets that inevitably get named after whoever created it. So if you ever walk into a company and there's that's the Bob spreadsheet, it's because some guy named Bob used to work there and made a 50 megabyte spreadsheet. Bob left and no one understands how to fix it. Or Bob is still there and he's stuck being unable to get promoted. I don't even want to get into all the problems with using spreadsheets for budgeting because there are too many. By the way, I love Excel. It's the greatest viewer of grids of information the world has ever known. It's amazingly flexible. My grandmother uses Excel to track probably her recipes and VHS collection. It's not a good budget tool, just not a good system. So how did we get there? How do we get to this place where no one's really, really happy? I'm going to take you back to a historical time. Let's go back to the late 1880s. To Mickey's Christmas Carol. So Cratchit is working extremely hard, probably the day before Christmas. He wasn't preparing a budget, at least not as we know it nowadays. And there was a good reason for it. When Scrooge and Cratchit were working on their books for the month, the focus was on figuring out how profitable they were, how much money was in the bank account, how much did they earn. There wasn't a whole lot in terms of what's going to happen. You know, are we going to spend any different next month than we did last month? Is our business going to suddenly increase or suddenly decrease? Why didn't they care? Why did they care about looking ahead? You know, it's really hard to change the past. Why didn't anybody do it? It's because the world changed really slowly. The economy, internal factors, external factors, they changed so slowly, they didn't really need to think that hard about how the world might change. So it started off with, let's just report backwards. So Scrooge would walk into Cratchit and say, you can leave as soon as you tell me how much money I have, because I need to know how much money I have so I can figure out how I'm going to spend it. And it really was kind of just that old thing. Think of it as Scrooge having a bag of gold coins. And he said to Cratchit, how many coins are in that bag, so I have some idea of how many coins I'm going to spend. Well, since business changed so slowly, the very first budgets, what they would actually do is go line item by line item, and they would look back at what you had done over the last year, and they would copy the number over and assume what happened in 1896 is probably what's going to happen in 1897. Now, that's pretty short-sighted, but it handled things like cyclicality. So say you were in the, I don't know, coal business. There's a lot more coal usage when it gets cold in the winter than there is in the middle of summer. So you're going to run at a deficit for a few months during the summer until you get back to kind of the colder times. At least if we copy last year's numbers over to next year, we can kind of see where that dip was. At least it got people thinking about the future, even if the future was only like 1 year. So good for cyclical events, worked great until outside things happen. There are a couple of problems with this. By the way, people doing this began the downfall of modern budgeting because they literally copied over every single number from last year that they had, and they copied it over into next year. That is way too much detail. As a general rule, if you are planning to the level you have actuals, you're planning at too low of a level. And the reason is it's not going to drive you to a different physical action. It's actually going to cause you to do the exact same thing. So rather than record and track, well, how much cornmeal versus wheat flour versus rye flour was purchased by our grocery customers, it's probably better to know the average shopper spends $500 per year at the store. The number of shoppers has remained stable, or maybe it's grown steadily by 10% each year. So number one problem, too much detail. And people confuse detail with its ability to be helpful. You know, oh, we have 7 decimal points. That must be a really rock solid number. Imagine if you use Google Maps and it said your journey from your house to the sports arena, it's going to take 37.23698 minutes. You kind of call BS. It's not that those additional numbers think it's more accurate. You're like, yeah, they're just making that up. Like, they can't know if there's a stoplight or if maybe I go a little faster, a little slower. So they round up. And that's frankly more helpful. The other big problem with this taking last year and copying it over to next year, as the year went on, especially if things changed, you'll have a larger and larger discrepancy between actuals and budget. And that's because if you have an inaccurate projection, it starts small, but then those factors become cumulative and they add up over time and they make the gap wider and wider. Budgets based on historical numbers, they don't take into account internal issues, they don't take into account external issues, they don't take into account input from users. Managers might know, hey, we need to upgrade our equipment, or we have this new equipment, so we have to hire people with a specialized skill set, which might help increase our usage, but it's going to increase our wage expense. So all that knowledge, that really good human power, basically was ignored. And it was ignored until there was a gap between actual and budget. And then again, people would go get yelled at. So what did they do? They said, we probably should just go ask people. Based on what you know, you're a knowledgeable expert. Right? You can look at last year, but don't just copy it over. Hey, Mrs. Manager, look at last year, look at those numbers, figure out what next year is going to look like. And they created the bottoms-up annual budget. Now, they were trying to replace copying last year into next year. So they made a big mistake when they created the bottoms-up annual budgets. They did it at the same level of detail that they had actuals. So good news, got people forward thinking. It was getting input from all the different end users and all the different managers. It took into account external factors. What are the problems? It's that detail issue. The human brain, getting into a little cognitive science here for a second. Gee, Edward, this is not where I thought you'd go. If you see 5 things listed out, stamps, copy charges, posters, pencils, and payroll, your mind essentially gives as much effort to each of those 5 numbers. But think about it as one of those numbers is 90% of your overall budget, and it's payroll, right? So I should instead spend 90% of my time on the things that matter and 10% of my time on those things that don't actually matter. But that's not what we do, because we give people a line to fill it in. Well, you must want me to think just as much about stamps as you do about what I'm going to spend on my number of people for the upcoming year. It also takes a huge amount of time. This is part of the reason why nobody's terribly happy during budget season, because it just takes a long time to distribute everything out. It takes a long time to get all that data back in from thousands and thousands of managers. We're asking them to budget every single sticky note on every single wall of a cubicle. It takes forever to compile it, forever to report on it. Because it takes so much time, we actually only do it once a year. And then again, we have the same problem. It gets more and more inaccurate as we move through the calendar. The greatest budgeting tool on earth, and this is a hill I will die on, is Google Maps, because Google Maps always gives you an updated amount of time for the rest of your journey. It doesn't go, okay, I know I originally told you 39 minutes, but you've actually been driving really, really fast. So I'm going to need you to take a few wrong turns so that you don't accidentally get there in 35 minutes. No, if you're driving faster, it says, cool, you're not going to make it in 30. Now you're going to make it in 20. You only have 6 minutes left. You're 3 minutes away from your destination. And it never spends its time looking backwards. It's just constantly real-time information. The other big problem with the bottoms-up budget, somebody has an idea in their head already of what they want the total number to be. So they will take your information and go, thank you for the thousands of person hours you just put in. You're wrong, though. I'm going to switch it. So somebody got the great idea, since there was already an idea in the head of a CFO or a CEO or a COO. Why don't we start there? Why don't instead we ask them what they think the number is going to look like based on all those external factors? Because the lower you go in the organization, the more people look internally. Makes sense, right? You're looking at your internal department. The higher up you go, the more they're looking externally. So top down, come up with that number, take a number, allocate it down. It's forward thinking, considers external factors. It's an input mechanism for executive management. It's nicely done at a high level. So it's done on the big picture type of things. It's a wonderful tool because we're doing it at a high level. It's also problematic because we're doing it at a really high level. You don't necessarily know as an executive, and as CEO of Argonaut Interroll, I will admit this to you. Sometimes I don't know what's actually going down at the ground level. I'll say something like, oh, we should really increase our utilization by 5%. Now, that seems doable. 5% is not that much. Well, the managers know, yeah, our actual department's already at 97% utilization. So the only way we can go up 5% is either people start working a whole lot of overtime, or we have to hire more people. So I factored it in as a revenue increase, and the people on the ground go, wait a second, that's either a compensation increase, it's going to result in additional expenses. So top-down planning would tell managers to do a number that they thought was impossible. So how did people solve this? Most organizations did both. That's better than doing one or the other, but there's going to be a gap, because top down, we think this is what's going to occur. Bottom up, we think this is what's going to occur. They never actually line up. So how do we actually deal with this? Well, it's actually good that there's a gap, because we have to have an open conversation. We have to talk about what we wanted to happen is not what's actually possible from the bottom up. That's a good conversation to have. It gets all the stakeholders involved, rather than top down changing the number from the bottom up, or bottom up going, thanks, that's impossible. I'm going to go off and do this other thing and ignore you. We get all the right stakeholders involved to have a good, knowledgeable conversation. The disadvantage takes a while. Getting that gap to close. It's like, well, I want you to have 5% utilization without increasing expenses. I can't do it without increasing expenses. Therefore, I can't increase 5%. Well, no, I really would like 5%. So what is your expense increase going to look like? We eventually close that. By the way, what most organizations are doing nowadays, the average organization, is they're starting with a top-down plan, allocating it out, going to the managers and going, this is the logic behind it. Is this number reasonable? Can you hit this based on everything you know? Rather than do them completely independently, have them actually not line up and then have that conversation later. But all these are still annual budgets. They're done once a year, either top down or bottom up. And that gave rise to forecasting. Forecasting, as I said earlier, higher level. It started off kind of being updated quarterly, populated with actuals from those prior months. It was flexible. That's good. We're not tied to that number we set at the start of the year that we now know is going to be wrong. We can actually update it. What are the pains? It still stopped at year end, as if there was this magic wall none of us could see beyond, and it involved fewer people. We actually kind of want the input from all those people. Well, to make forecasting easier, somebody said, well, what if we just changed a few key numbers? What if we didn't actually go budget everything through the entire P&L when it turns out 80% of our profitability comes from how many FTEs do we actually have? What are our units and what's the rate we're going to sell them for? Those three numbers drive 80% of our profitability. Start by reforecasting those three numbers. And that gave rise to the driver-based plan. So it focuses on what truly, not to use the term again, drives the business. And as those key drivers change, oh, we're selling more units, or oh, our price has gone up because of inflation, all the related items change too. And that really reduced down that planning cycle time. What are the pains? People are still stuck in that old mindset where I need a dollar amount and I'm going to hold you accountable for the dollar amount. So because we use the drivers to calculate dollars, people still hold people accountable for the dollars. They don't go, yeah, you doubled your revenue. Of course you would double your number of people. They go, yes, you doubled your revenue, but what's up with your expense budget? You spent far more than you needed to. Well, they're both based on how many people I needed. Switching to a driver-based plan is quite often a cultural change. People are used to typing dollar numbers into a grid. Also, there's no generally accepted accounting principle for what the drivers should be. So coming up with a driver-based plan involves going, those dollars are a reporting indicator. They're a lagging indicator. They are an output. Truly, what are the things that actually lead to those? Well, we eventually realized with our forecasting, probably not a good idea to stop at a magic wall. I think of it as like variable rate headlights. Nobody wants headlights at the start of the year can see 120 feet. 3 months into the year, now they can only see 90 feet. 6 months left in the year, my headlights only work for 60 feet. 3 months left in the year, 30 feet out, and I'm going to hit a wall. But all of a sudden, right before the end of the year, someone cleans my headlights off, and now I could suddenly see 120 feet into the future. If I can see 120 feet, by God, I can always see 120 feet or 180 feet. So that gave rise to rolling forecast. Whatever my confidence interval is, that's how far out I want to be forecasting in all cases. Every month or every quarter or every week, I replace the oldest period of forecast with a period of actuals, and I keep pushing that thing out. Rolling forecasts, they give you more accuracy. When things are unexpected, you immediately get them updated. Pain points, if you're still forecasting using a bunch of dollar typing and a bunch of people, doing that more often is going to make even more people upset. You've got to bring it up to a higher level. Also, some people get a little weird about, if you let's you go at 18 months. Right now, that means you've got 9 months of, because you get all the rest of this year, and then you get 9 months to 2023. That kind of weirds some people out, that they can't see a total for 2023. So if that's fine, whatever your confidence interval is. If somebody really wants to see a year total, you can just trend it for those last 3 months, or get people comfortable with timeliness versus precision and totaling. Timeliness says, a number you gave me this morning that's 98% accurate, so much more helpful than a number that was 100% accurate that was done 3 months ago. You know, give me an updated real-time number. Again, think Google Maps. If I had to tell you best practices from 5-10 years ago, it's rolling forecast driver based. It's kind of now table stakes. There's some other things that people wanted to start doing, which is, yeah, I want to plan from anywhere. I want to do analytics from anywhere. I shouldn't have to be sitting at my desk in Excel, with it up all the time. But at the end of the day, if you, until as recently as 5 years ago, if you had a rolling forecast driver-based, you could get to it from anywhere and it was in a system, cool. You probably bragged about it at cocktail parties. And then the world went crazy. Before COVID, the world started changing. The world started branching, if you will, in the world of budgeting. Now we're going to get to the revolutionary stuff. So thanks, Edward, for the walkthrough history. Some of you are going, yeah, we ditched rolling forecast and driver based a while ago. We're onto some of this stuff. Some of you are like, wow, I was supposed to have rolling forecast and driver based in 2016. I have to immediately run out and tell everybody. Let's assume you have that. Where's the world actually going? What has happened since 2016? I started in the world of FP&A. I had no gray in my beard. I did have a beard since I was 16. But if you go back 20 plus years ago, the level of budgeting that changed from the time I started in the budgeting world, like 95 through like 2016, so 21 years, I've seen more change in the last 5 than I did from 1995 to 2016. So we're going to talk about something that is really, really cutting edge from 1973. Sometimes people come up with a catchy new idea and they think, oh my God, I'm the first person ever to think about that. It's the cool new thing. And they don't realize they're actually using an idea that was 50 years old. So over the last 5 years, people started talking heavily about zero-based budgeting. This is actually an idea from the 1960s. It was a Texas Instrument account manager named Peter Pyer. Almost sounds like Peter Piper. And he was trying to get people to stop copying last year's numbers to next year and then just upping them by some percentage. So he did this at TI, at Texas Instruments. And it's a little more complicated than I'm making it sound. It's not just starting next year kind of fresh. But he wrote this book. And he said, here's why, if you really want to control your expenses, you can't just keep upping them. And there was this governor in Georgia, and he read this book in 1973, and he thought it was pretty neat. So he said, I'm going to use this as my ethos for all budgeting in Georgia. And it talked about essentially how you can't use last year's numbers to plan for next year, but instead start with a clean slate and then justify your actions. Justify what actions you actually want us to take. If there's something you want to do that's new, put it into what he called decision packages that people are going to discuss and decide, oh, if we did nothing else, it would look like this. But if we made these couple of decisions, we'd be spending money like this. This humble governor in Georgia used this to wild success. He actually controlled the budget because Georgia was, like many governmental institutions at the time, was a use it or lose it mentality. Well, since next year will be an increase of percentage of my spend this year, I better spend all the money I possibly can that I'm budgeted this year. Otherwise, I won't get more next year. So it made him hugely successful in Georgia to the point that some would argue it actually launched him to the next stage of his political career. And he became President Carter. And he said, I'm going to take that tool I used to such great success in Georgia, and I'm going to insist it be used across the entire federal government, which lasted until it was ruled unconstitutional. It's like, no, you actually can't do that. You have to let Congress budget however it is they want to budget, and they're a use it or lose it group. To them, a cut is a cut in an increase of a percentage. So he said, fine, I'm going to do this in the branch I am allowed to control. So he issued this executive order making the executive branch have to follow ZBB, zero-based budgeting. And it worked. It actually controlled spending in the executive branch until Ronald Reagan became president. And literally the first act Ronald Reagan did on becoming president was he issued an executive order repealing all of Carter's executive orders. And ZBB promptly died in the federal government. And then it kind of disappeared for a whole lot of years. Now, overall, ZBB is a good thing. Looking at last year's actuals and the prior year's budget to come up with next year's budget leads to a bunch of problems. It leads to that use it or lose it mentality, not just at the federal government, but at a lot of companies. Budgets only ever increase. Like, oh, well, last year we went to Cabo. Next year we got to go to Cabo or something better, right? Oh, we can't have the sales group go meet at a factory because it always has to be better than last year. It also gets into this same thing, different year. So zero-based budgeting says we're going to start each year clean. Every expense has to be justified. All revenue has to be independently explained on how we're going to get there. And initiatives have to be budgeted for an increase. So ZBB took off over the last few years, this major resurgence, and some companies actually said it is the secret to our success. I'll give you an example. If you go Google this, AB InBev. This is the company that owns, among other things, Anheuser-Busch. And they actually used ZBB on their path towards global domination. So this is an article from actually 14 years ago. This is from 2008. Notice in the second paragraph, zero-based budgeting is central to InBev's business model. Over the last few years, though, it got really, really popular until it didn't. Zero-based budgeting ran into the cancel culture rampant throughout today. I'll give you a bad example. This is from 3 years ago. So Kraft stock was at $96 a share in 2017. Last time I looked, it was at about $35 a share. It actually was as low as $22 a share for a while. And Kraft had actually gotten into this cycle of, if it doesn't make sense in the current fiscal year, it never makes sense. And it stopped Kraft Heinz from innovating on their products. Their products got, quite frankly, stale. And when their stock plummeted, they actually blamed it on zero-based budgeting. So if you actually go back, it's like, yep, that was the reason why we failed. We tried it, and it's bad for a company that needs to innovate. So Kraft, they've, excuse me, they still have it in some portions. They've gotten rid of it in some others. Research and development, R&D, is actually gone away from zero-based budgeting at Kraft. And it's because it takes years to show a gain. And zero-based budgeting pretty much says, if you can't show a benefit in this time period, we're not going to spend money on it. So just be aware, ZBB, this is a 10-minute long tangent on ZBB. It can lead to some short-term thinking, which is bad when your competitors are playing the long game. However, there's some great advantages to it because it gets you out of, because that's the way we've always done it. That's the way we're going to keep doing it. Just be careful with it. Be careful with all of this, I think is what I should be saying. Speaking of what's old is new again, I've been talking about integrated business planning, IBP, for like 10 plus years at this point. IBP is about connecting every stage of your planning process. And keep in mind, there are a lot of stages. So for instance, you'll start with a long-term strategic 5-year plan. Now, in a perfect IBP world, that long-term strategic plan drives your annual budget. We basically allocate it down and go, this is your starting number for your annual budget. Does this make sense? Well, then you take that annual budget and you go, okay, cool. That annual budget is going to require this amount of revenue or this amount of projects or this amount of people, and it drives kind of a more detailed S&OP plan. Well, that bottoms up revenue and project plan then says, do we have enough machine capacity? Do we have enough people power? Can we actually hire it enough? Do we have a constraint-based model? Well, we might find out that our constraints make it so we can't hit those revenues numbers. We can't hit those annual budget numbers. So that feeds into the rolling forecast. What do we think is actually realistic? And wherever your rolling forecast is should feed back into your long-term plan. Because let's say you're beating numbers by 10%. Cool. It's going to affect the 5-year plan. What if we're missing them by 10%? Okay, that's not great, but it's going to affect the 5-year plan. Integrated business planning came about because traditionally all 5 of those steps in the planning process were done in 5 different technologies. Some of them might even not even be done in a technology. Long-term strategic planning might be done in a boardroom with people talking about things out loud. But if we put all those into a system, we want to make sure they're all connected. Now, keep in mind, IBP, it's kind of a given if you started with nothing. Like if you came into an organization, you would never build 5 siloed systems that didn't talk to each other. You'd make sure that they all talk. So IBP kind of got a reputation as a way of connecting the plumbing for various portions that were out there. Lately, kind of like ZBB, zero-based budgeting, IBP has come back into vogue, but it now has an extra letter. Because if 3-letter acronyms are cool, 4-letter acronyms, even better. So Oracle and a few other companies have started lately talking about IBPX, which is integrated business planning and execution. Execution meaning you're actually doing something with that plan. Rather than just go, cool, I've finished my plan, it becomes a column in a spreadsheet now. Well, why don't we take and actually do something valuable with those numbers? So IBP and IBPX are basically about every step in that planning process tying to the next step in the planning process. Now, this is not a technological based presentation by any means. I'm actually trying to stay as technology agnostic as I possibly can. There's actually a good page on oracle.com all about integrated business planning and execution. So even if you're not using Oracle, I recommend you go out and look at it. There's a nice solution briefing on kind of how to tie all of these things together on IBP, integrated business planning, tying it together into an executed world. At the end of the day, it's really about enterprise-wide planning. Doesn't matter if it happens in the office of the CIO, the CMO, the CRO, the CHRO, the CFO, go tie it all together, all the various components that make it up. So your financial plan, your supply chain plan, your demand plan, your S&OP plan, tie all that together into an integrated plan. Why is this valuable? If you don't link all those things together, if you don't, every time you generate a number, feed it to the next number, you're going to go off in some wildly different directions. You're going to not just have that gap between top-down and bottoms-up planning that I mentioned before, you're going to have gaps between every possible planned number in the organization. And you won't have those gaps because you need to have a healthy conversation. You're going to have those gaps because the numbers just flat out don't tie. Sometimes things go by 17 different names. So it used to be called what if modeling. It's been replaced by 3 different terms. Some people call it scenario planning. Some people call it scenario modeling. Some people calling it having plans ready at hand. Fundamentally, scenario planning, actually, by the way, I like the term ready at hand plans because it's not just about planning for a potential scenario. It's about keeping those scenarios in case that situation occurs. But fundamentally, scenario planning says these are the 3 to 5 situations that are most likely to occur in the upcoming year. I'm going to not only plan financials for each of those 3 to 5 situations, I'm going to plan a set of actions that if that situation actually occurs, this is how I'm going to respond to it because I don't want to have to respond in the moment. Some people think of it as what ifing. What ifing is more like, well, if I increase units sold by 5%, what happens to my expenses? What happens to my profitability? What happens to my headcount? Scenario planning is more, if this product launch is successful, what impact is it going to have on the organization? If the product launch fails miserably, what decisions will I have to make? If my sales force attrition hits 30%, what impact is that going to have on my revenue? What if commodity prices keep increasing? What if inflation keeps increasing? What if China is taking Russia's invasion of Ukraine and using it as a trial balloon to decide if they think they can get away with invading Taiwan? That's a realistic scenario. And if you think that's one of your 3 to 5 most likely ones, you plan for that because it's not just semiconductors that's going to be harder to get. It's going to cause a whole lot of other ripples and sanctions in the world economy. Have that plan ready. So scenario planning or any of those other names like ready at hand plans, it's useful for being ready for those alternate scenarios. And if you can, have a set of actions ready. And if it's possible, if there's a really good scenario, try and make that scenario happen. I don't mean like convince China to invade Taiwan. There's a really good scenario like, well, what if this product launch succeeded wildly? Look at all the benefits. Go make that product launch succeed wildly. On the other hand, if there's a really bad situation, like, wow, what if my sales force attrition not only beat 30%, what if 50% of my sales force quit? That would be catastrophic. Make sure that scenario does not occur. So keep that plan at hand, but then make sure it doesn't actually get realized, or make sure it gets realized as much as you possibly can. Fast forward to 2020. So scenario planning, what if modeling has been around since like Excel and Lotus 1, 2, 3 were created, because that's kind of how they work. Change a number, all the numbers change. Scenario planning was pretty big. Southwest Airlines got everybody excited about it like in 2001, but it's kind of one of those, yeah, it takes forever to plan a number. I don't really have time to plan like 5 numbers. I'm just going to do one. Fast forward to 2020. This whole plague thing happened. Kids, go look up on the World Wide Web something called COVID-19. It was bad, trust me. We not only had to walk uphill to school in the snow, we had to wear masks and stay 6 feet apart from each other while we walked in the snow. So I'm sure that's all behind us. It's like, oh, what is this plague thing of which Edward speaks? What we call the plague years caused an even more rapid shift towards certain budgeting things. And this kind of started in 2020, because 2020 started off with, this is going to be the roaring 20s. Everything is going to be fine. One budget's enough. And then coronavirus came along, smacked everyone in the face. And all we knew 2 weeks into March is that all our budgets were going to be wrong. How did most people respond? They exported their budgets to Excel, unless they already were set up to do scenario planning. They exported it to Excel, or they did it in their system if it had the capability, and they planned for 3 scenarios. What if we recover quickly? What if we take a while to recover? What if we're in a U-shaped recession that lasts till 2023 and beyond? Over the last 2 years, COVID, in all seriousness, made everyone realize the world isn't predetermined. Crazy things happened. For instance, 6 weeks ago, Russia told everybody they weren't going to invade Ukraine. And we all rushed into 2020 and we said, shoot, we have to make these extra scenarios all of a sudden. And we did what, this is an Edward term. It's what I call, we did reactionary scenario planning. And if I could quote the CFO of Coca-Cola, he didn't want to call it reactionary scenario planning. He called it scenario management. What he said was, if this thing happens to us, this is how we will respond. So it was more about, if this bad thing occurs, or this bad thing occurs, or this bad thing occurs, this is how we will deal with it. The good news, it got people thinking about possible scenarios. The bad news, it was only in response to events. We were looking ahead, but we were looking ahead by responding to what had already happened. So we spent 2020 essentially reacting to the world. Things happened to us and we responded. We did not go out and happen to things. So starting in 2021, people said, wow, number one, Excel, probably a bad place to do the scenario planning. Number two, probably should be focusing on what might happen and actually planning ahead, being proactive. Before COVID, if I get a little luxury for a second, people thought about scenario planning as a nice to have. Now it's just as much a must have, just as much a must have as driver based is, or having a rolling forecast. So if you ask me, minimum best practice in 2022, driver based rolling forecast, accessible from anywhere in a system that has scenario planning. Anyone not planning for multiple scenarios is going to get passed by the competition. Now, does that mean you can plan for everything? No, there's no way to know that Russia was, you might have a scenario for it, but probably was pretty unlikely that you thought Russia was actually going to invade Ukraine. But you could have a system on, what if globalization slows down? What if inflation ramps up? What if the war for talent increases? As companies are preparing their scenarios for 2022 and beyond, we just have to pivot from being backward looking and about potential scenarios to just being proactive about the scenarios we want to make happen, that we want to follow through, because something is going to go awry again. I actually prepared this deck before Russia invaded Ukraine. So you're not going to see any Ukraine slides like anywhere in here. And I had this, something is going to go wrong in the world. All this has happened before, in the words of the great Cylon prophet, and all this will happen again. Or to change that slightly, if the world can figure out a way to frack everything up, it will. There will be another catastrophic event. There will be something global changing. And again, I created this slide before Russia. So take the time now to plan for how we're going to respond to the world doing something crazy, so that you're not reacting in the moment. Yet another thing that goes by 10 different names, initiative planning. This is where you propose a bunch of new ideas, kind of similar to ZBB's decision package. At the end of the day, it all comes down to determining what your measurement will be for your initiatives, your projects, your investments, your portfolios. Sorting by that measurement, determining how much money you have to spend, then drawing the lines, like sort them all, draw the line in the middle of the investments based on how much you want to invest. Everything above that line is in for now, but should be reevaluated throughout the year. Make sure it's still meeting the metric, and verify that nothing else has actually risen up in terms of importance. Everything below that line is out. Again, kind of for right now. We have to plan for these projects and these initiatives because the world changes. We want to accelerate our growth. We want to accelerate our revenue. We want to make sure that we're managing risk and reducing our risk of failure. We want to make sure that we're improving our efficiency and refocusing our time and efforts on our strategic objectives. We want to make sure that we're amplifying our talent. We're recognizing who the contributors are and rewarding the go-getters and punishing the weak. That's probably not a good thing to say. We want to make sure that we're enhancing our competitiveness. We want to make sure that in a low margin competitive business that we have to critically take care of our customers. So if you think about financial planning for, it doesn't matter if you call them projects or initiatives or investments, think of it like a stock portfolio. Now, when you, just like walking into a candy store, a kid's like, I wish to have everything, please. You can't fund everything. Some of them might actually be contradictory. So your initial screen is toss everything in. And I could try and do all of that. going to cost too much money. It's going to be counterproductive. It's going to defocus my people. So then you say, well, let's at least figure out what our strategic objectives are and which of those initiatives or projects or investments kind of line up with those strategic goals. Further, we can narrow it down to, well, I only have this much money, or I only have this many people, so I'm only going to fund those specific projects that are out there. We need to figure out if we have the right portfolio mix. So just like a stock mix, you don't want to invest in everything. You also don't want to put it in all into one sector. You want to make sure that you're investing in the right areas. And if those projects or initiatives turn out to be bad ones, you want to pull money from them and give more money to another project. And most companies, projects, initiatives, investments, it's like once they're started, no one ever looks back. Like they'll evaluate them based on return on investment before the project ever begins. No one ever stops and says, are we still hitting that return on investment? So we have to get into a world where we have a way to plan for all of our projects and then rank them. There's got to be a way to propose a project or investment. We can sort them somehow, determine which ones we're going to fund. We're going to approve them, but then we're going to monitor them, just like a stock portfolio. Am I getting the return that I expected? Or maybe the project's going to take longer. Maybe it's going to finish faster. Maybe something else is suddenly become more strategically important. Update it, reforecast, make sure they support your overall objectives. So the biggest question that I tend to get asked is, how do I rank them? Is it just, what if I sorted alphabetically and drew the line between F and G and everything A through F? No, that's a bad idea. There are approximately an infinite number of different things we could rank by. First one, this is definitely the most common by a long shot, is return on investment, ROI. It's tried, it's true. You can set a time horizon really easily. It's easy to calculate a return on investment. If you're going to do this one with any of these metrics, don't just do it before the project ever starts or the initiative ever starts. I realize you spelled initiative wrong. Constantly go back and determine, are you still hitting those ROI goals? Next most common is probably internal rate of return, IRR, followed by net present value. These are all available online if you're curious about them. Profitability index, there's a great article out there on it. ROIC, return on invested capital. That's if you have a massive amount of money you're spending on something big before it returns any value, you might be looking at investments based on ROIC. Like let's say you're in the cruise industry, cruise ships cost 9 digits to buy. If you're going to buy that ship, make sure it's actually going to hit the return that you expected. Balanced scorecard, actually, I like this one. It's where you measure and then weigh the measures across 4 different perspectives: financial, customer, internal, organizational growth. This is my favorite because it gives you a nice, well-rounded view of a project. The others are more purely, does this project/initiative/investment make more money than another one? Balanced scorecard more says, is this where I want to be for strategic reasons, client impact reasons, people experience reasons, so on. And then realistically, across just the customers I've done project initiative planning with, there are about 1,000 more metrics because everyone has their own idea of what's important. Stick to the 6 above unless you have a really, really good reason. Don't get me wrong, every company is unique, but unless you have the world's best reason to not use one of the top 6, don't go off and go, well, we have our way of deciding which initiatives we should do, or because inevitably what that means is somebody wants to do something for a gut feel reason. My heart just thinks this is the right thing. And I've created a metric to show that my heart is correct. The key thing, manage these initiatives, manage these projects, manage this proposed new spending as if they're a portfolio of stocks. Invest in what makes sense. Stop spending money on them when they stop making sense. And just because some spending money on something makes sense now, doesn't mean it always will. Shift your resources to a new project, shift your resources to a new idea if something better shows up. Xerox, Sears, Kodak, Kmart, they were great investments once. Now we spend our money elsewhere. Do the same thing. So now we're going to get on the truly cutting edge of the planning revolution. These are some more interesting ideas. Some of them have been around for a bit, kind of like ZBB and IBPX. They've been around for a while and they've evolved. But these are some of the ones that are still on the edges of adoption. That's probably the right way to put it. even if they've been around for 10 or 15 years, they're not like widely used. The biggest surge in the last 2 years has definitely been scenario planning, or by its many other names. If you're not doing that one, stop what you're doing in 10 minutes. Stop listening to the webcast, 10 minutes. Go off and implement that. These other ones, ponder. I'm going to hit these pretty quickly. Beyond budgeting, you're going to stop doing annual budgets. You're going to set some targets. You're going to have a rolling forecast that eventually includes all of next year. You're going to snapshot it, call that your budget. And then you're going to do some constraint-based modeling. You're going to do that down at the operational level. Continuous planning says, don't just plan periodically. Update your plan whenever something happens. Keep the plan always open, always updated, and always as accurate as you can based on the internal and external factors. Again, Google Maps. Keep it updated to tell you how many minutes you have remaining in your journey. Better information or timely information means better decision making. Now, this inherently means a high level, because you want people, like the second you close a big deal, the second you open a new factory, or the second you determine inflation is real, go put it into the underlying system. Graphical planning, I actually really like this one. I really wish people would do it. People plan in grids of information, yet what we actually want people to do is focus on trends. We want them to make sure expenses are going down and revenue is going up. It's really difficult to see those, virtually impossible to see those in a grid of data. We now have the capability through graphical dashboards to actually see, is revenue getting better, or is our expenses actually getting worse? Actually, in some of the more modern graphical planning tools, you don't even have to type it into a grid and see it in a chart. You can actually drag and drop the chart and say, well, let's up this curve a little bit. I don't know why we have a dip here. Let's go drag that dip up so it doesn't actually happen. Wow, we're not going to hit those growth curves. Let's actually drag those things down. It'll update your data right away. I like graphical planning just because it makes sense to me. We should be planning in graphs, not in grids. But there's an idea that's critical. So I predicted, it took me a few years till I was right, but I predicted scenario planning was going to take the world by storm. This is my next prediction of what will take the world by storm. Range-based forecasting. Sometimes if you went to an Ivy League school called corridor forecasting, range-based forecasting says my expenses will be between X and Y. My revenue will be between Y and Z. Most organizations force you to give a single number. And the problem is they think that means it's more accurate, actually means it's less accurate. It's more helpful to say my expenses will be between 800 and 1,000. If you force me to a specific number, I'm going to tell you my expenses are going to be 1,000, because I don't want you to yell at me if I spend all that amount of money. So I have lost information by going to a specific number. I had more information knowing that I was 95% sure it was going to be between 800 and 1,000. You forced me down to one number. You made me throw away information that I could have given you that could have been helpful. It's a little difficult to aggregate ranges. You don't want to aggregate the worst case across the board, or it's like, oh, we could theoretically be out of business on Tuesday. You don't want to aggregate all the best possible numbers across the board, or it's going to be like, we're going to achieve world domination by the end of the year. You kind of need to, there's the math is tricky, but you need to come up with a 95% confidence interval that I'm going to be between this best case, this worst case, and then you can actually get a set of numbers. You can get an expected case with some level of confidence. So any modern planning tool, like obviously my background is Oracle. I do this all the time in Oracle EPM Cloud Planning, but any really good tool should let you easily be able to come up with a range-based forecast. Strongly consider this one. Predictive planning simply says, hey, looking at the past, where am I likely to go? Use historical trends, use correlations, use seasonality to predict the future. This also will give you a best case, a worst case, and expected case. It will give you a 95% confidence range without humans having to type it in. Sometimes a computer can tell you in 5 minutes what thousands of people hours will eventually come up with as the same number. It's quite often as accurate as those detailed budgets. That said, humans review the budgets. Computers don't know outside influences. They don't know what's happening in the outside world. So like right now, inflation's, depending on the country, 5% to, well, hyperinflation, 40+%. Let's assume it's all around 10%. Well, the computer says, oh, that's going to disappear really quickly. It's a data anomaly. We historically haven't had it for the last few years. We're going to have it's going to disappear again. After a couple more months of that, the computer is going to assume inflation is going to stay there forever at 8% or 10%. A human has to come in and go, well, I'm going to apply a little external knowledge and think those numbers are going to drip down. You might have heard of success factor planning, sometimes called KPI planning, sometimes called key leading indicator planning. All this means is you plan for the drivers. You plan for the key leading indicators, the KPIs. You don't convert them to dollar amounts. You measure people on their KPIs, and you measure how those KPIs align with your strategic initiatives. The only budget you do is at a consolidated level. And then you actually measure people on their ability to budget a KPI and their ability to beat the performance required by that KPI. It incentivizes the right behavior. I'm a big believer in it, especially at the managerial level. You actually don't want those people fiddling around with dollars. You want them fiddling around with service level metrics. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Tinder for budgeting. It's really simple. If you have a budget number you like, you swipe it to the right. If you don't like your budget, you swipe it to the left. I just made that up. It doesn't actually exist. There are a lot of practices that you need to implement if you actually want a good cutting edge system that's going to differentiate you from the competition. Things like, I want to make sure that my budget actually is linked to what my corporate strategy is. I want to make sure that it's going to be simple, valuing timeliness over precision. I want to make sure that it's flexible, that if my business changes, my budget system doesn't hold it back. Your budget should reflect your current conditions. If it doesn't, you should change your budget process or your budget system. Our plans have to be realistic. I don't want Google Maps telling me, well, if you hit every single green light in the planet, you could probably make that trip in 20 minutes. I want it planning for some level of red lights to actually occur. There has been a push, this is kind of like a pendulum, goes back and forth between everybody in the organization gets to do the plan to only the people in FP&A get to do the plan. The right thing is somewhere in the middle. Just make it easy on everybody. Use technology to do it. Technology can give you things like better security, better workflow, a common repository, common database, common business rules, easy reporting, easy analytics, a nice audit trail of where the budget looks like. If I could change one thing, if I could just wave a magic wand across everybody, it would be to have a stop tying people's bonuses to their ability to beat a number that they came up with. Don't tie performance measures to budgets. Tie it to the things that you want people to actually do. Tie it to their KPIs, tie it to those key leading indicators. Make sure it ties into your strategy. Strategic plans should go 5 to 10 years out, however far out your strategy goes, basically. Don't do the Dilbert plan. A good strat plan should be at an aggregate level, should be based on business rules, should drive the planning process. Get the level of detail right. Make sure that people, while they might not be happy that it's time to update the forecast, at least they'll see the value in it. It's like, yeah, just like I don't want my Google Maps screen to freeze. I really would like a good updated bit of information. If we're doing this correctly, it should be a good blending of what people do well, what process does well, what technology does well. I get the question, where can I go to find lots of good best practices in budgeting and planning? As soon as I write that book, I will, and I've been working on it. Problem is, started a few years ago, and then the world of budgeting went haywire, and I kind of need to throw it out and start over again. I'll give you a couple of fun places to look right now for books. One is actually Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It talks about cognitive biases that we fall into when making predictions. His book is fascinating. I should do an entire webcast on Thinking Fast and Slow and how those cognitive biases affect people's ability to come up with a good forecast. Suffice to say, humans are bad at forecasting, but he explains why. Super forecasting also gives advice on how to be a better forecaster, a better predictor, both at work and in your personal life. So I recommend Philip Tetlock and Dan Gardner's book, also Daniel Kahneman's book. Hope you found this helpful. We've been building budgeting systems for, it'll be 25 years in May. We're actually about to hit our silver anniversary. We have some upcoming webcasts that I hope you can partake in. including some more technological based ones. We're doing a freeform app ones, basically, how can I build S-based cubes inside of Oracle EPM Cloud? We're doing a Groovy presentation. And I have a couple presentations. I'm actually going to do another version of this one. So if you liked what you heard today and want other people to hear it, please come to the Kscope conference. Across all the presentations, Interroll's doing, I think, 12 of them. This is important. Early bird registration expires tomorrow. If you're going to register for Kscope, do it today or tomorrow. The price goes up $300 or $400. Even if you miss that deadline, please always use our promo code. Type in Argonaut Interroll when it says, like, do you have a coupon or discount code? It'll knock the price, no matter when it is, before or after early bird. It'll knock down $100 per person. Share that code far and wide. I have no problems at all. If you're using my competitor, no problem. Give them this code. Have everybody go save $100. I hope this has been a valuable hour out of your life and you've learned a lot about revolutionizing budgeting and planning. My presentation is always changing because the world of budgeting and planning is always changing, just like your forecast should be. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you at Kscope in June there at the Gaylord Texan in the great state of Texas. Everybody have an awesome week.